The battlefield falls silent. The battle had raged for hours. Space was filled with fire, wreckage, and death. Human warships, once proud and mighty, now floated as broken husks in the dark void. The Zarkian Empire, the most feared alien race in the galaxy, had launched their final assault against humanity. The human fleet was losing. Admiral Darius Kane stood on the bridge of the HSS Valiant, gripping the command rail as explosions shook his ship. His officers worked desperately, shouting reports, trying to keep their systems running. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They couldn't win this battle. The Zarkian dreadnoughts were too strong. Their weapons tore through human defenses like paper. Their fighters swarmed the battlefield, picking off escape pods before they could flee. It was a massacre. Kane gritted his teeth as he watched another human battleship explode, its burning remains scattering in all directions. His fleet was down to its last few ships. The enemy was closing in. Then, something changed. It started with the sensors. Every screen on the Valiant flickered. Data feeds glitched, then went blank. The radar lost its readings. The ship's targeting systems reset on their own. "What the hell is going on?" Kane barked. "Sir, I don't know," his tactical officer stammered. "Something is interfering with our systems." Kane turned to the main view screen. His blood ran cold. A new warship had arrived. It wasn't on any of their radars. It didn't send any identification codes. It didn't communicate. It just appeared, as if it had always been there, waiting in the shadows. The Erebus, a ship that shouldn't exist. The impossible warship. The Erebus was massive, larger than any known human or alien vessel. Its hull was pitch black, absorbing all light, as if space itself was part of its design. It had no visible weapons, no exhaust trails, no energy readings. Yet it was there, and every ship in the battle knew it. The Zarkians hesitated. Their massive dreadnoughts, once unstoppable, suddenly stopped firing. Their fighters pulled back, regrouping like startled insects. Even the most ruthless warriors of the Empire felt something strange, a sensation they had never known before. Fear. Admiral Kane's hands clenched. He had never seen this ship before. It wasn't part of the human fleet. It wasn't part of any fleet. And yet, the battlefield had gone silent. No one spoke. No one fired. Every single ship was watching the Erebus. Then, without a sound, the Erebus moved. The warship that broke the rules. It didn't accelerate. It didn't use thrusters. It simply shifted forward, gliding through space like a ghost. The massive Zarkian fleet, moments ago eager to finish off the humans, slowly began to retreat. The enemy was afraid of this thing. "Sir," Kane's communications officer whispered, "we're receiving a message." Kane snapped his head toward her. "From who?" She swallowed. "Not from the Erebus. From the Zarkian flagship." That made Kane's stomach turn. The Zarkians never opened communication with humans. They had waged war for over a decade, wiping out colonies, destroying fleets, and never once had they spoken to their enemies. And yet now, they were calling. "Put it through," Kane ordered. The main screen flickered, and the face of High Lord Vrexa appeared. The alien leader's sharp red eyes were not filled with rage, as Kane had expected. They were filled with something else. Uncertainty. The Zarkian warlord glanced at the Erebus, his mandibles clicking nervously. "What is that?" he demanded. Kane didn't know how to answer. The Erebus wasn't responding. It wasn't moving aggressively. It was simply there, a black monolith in the stars. And it was watching. The silence before the storm. For the first time since the battle had begun, there was no sound, no gunfire, no explosions, just the quiet hum of ship engines and the slow movements of drifting wreckage. The humans didn't move. The aliens didn't move. The Erebus remained at the center, untouched, unshaken. Then, without warning, a single pulse of energy rippled from the Erebus. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a weapon. But every single Zarkian ship lost power for exactly 3.7 seconds. The entire enemy fleet went dark. And then, in an instant, their systems rebooted. The panic in their ranks was obvious. Some of their ships fled immediately, their captains too afraid to stay. Others stayed frozen, unsure whether to attack or retreat. On the Valiant, Admiral Kane could hardly breathe. "Sir," his officer whispered, "we are receiving another message." Kane turned. "From the Zarkians?" The officer shook his head. "No, sir. From the Erebus." The bridge fell into complete silence. Everyone turned to the screen as the first and only message from the Erebus appeared. It was one sentence, one message that would change the course of history forever. "When humanity is in danger, I will return." Kane felt a chill run through his body. The Zarkians must have felt it too because their entire fleet jumped into hyperspace. The battle was over. The impossible warship had arrived. And now, the universe knew fear. A ship that shouldn't exist. The Erebus remained motionless, floating like a silent predator in the void. Its dark hull reflected no light, no energy signatures, no movement. It was there, but at the same time, it felt like it wasn't. Admiral Kane stood frozen on the Valiant's bridge. His officers remained silent, their eyes locked on the view screen. The Zarkian fleet had vanished, retreating in a panic unlike anything seen before. But Kane wasn't focused on the enemy. His eyes were on the impossible ship that had just changed the course of the battle. "Can we get a scan on that thing?" Kane asked. The sensor officer shook his head. "Sir, our scanners aren't detecting it at all." Kane frowned. "That's impossible." The officer's hands trembled as he pressed controls. "It doesn't reflect radar. It doesn't emit heat. It's like it isn't even here." Kane's gut tightened. He had seen warships from every major faction in the galaxy, but never something like this. And yet, the Erebus had spoken. "When humanity is in danger, I will return." Who had sent that message? Was there a crew on board? Was it human? Or was it something else? The silence breaks. A low hum echoed through the bridge. It wasn't coming from the Valiant. It was coming from the Erebus. The entire ship began to shift, moving with unnatural precision. It didn't use thrusters, didn't seem to obey physics as normal ships did. It simply glided forward, heading deeper into space. "Sir, it's leaving," the helm officer reported. Kane narrowed his eyes. "Try to hail it." The comms officer hesitated. I don't think it will answer, sir." "Do it anyway." A moment of silence. Then, "Erebus, this is Admiral Kane of the United Terran Fleet." His voice was firm, but inside, he was filled with questions. "You saved us. Who are you? Where did you come from?" "Nothing." The ship continued its silent journey. Kane clenched his fists. "Are you human? Are you one of us?" Still no response. The Erebus was leaving, and Kane had no idea if they would ever see it again. A last attempt. Kane turned to his officers. "Can we get close to it? Dock with it?" The helm officer looked pale. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think we should." Kane understood his hesitation. The Erebus had obliterated a Zarkian dreadnought with a single shot. It had shut down an entire fleet for 3 seconds. If it saw them as a threat, they wouldn't stand a chance. But Kane couldn't let it go. "We need to know what this thing is," he said. "Get a boarding team ready. We need answers." His officers hesitated, then nodded. A squad of elite Marines suited up, preparing to launch toward the Erebus in a small shuttle. They had no idea what they would find. An impossible discovery. The shuttle approached the Erebus. Even up close, the ship felt wrong. It wasn't just the lack of signals. It was something else. Something unnatural. "I don't like this," one of the Marines muttered. Their leader, Commander Elias Ward, ignored him. "Stay focused." The shuttle systems glitched. Lights flickered. The engine struggled. Then, as they neared the Erebus hull, Every system shut down. The shuttle drifted, powerless. The Marines froze. "Sir," the pilot whispered, "we just lost all controls." Ward's breathing was steady. He looked out the viewport and saw something move inside the Erebus. A shape, a shadow. And then, a voice echoed through the shuttle, deep and unnatural. "You were not meant to come here." The Marine's blood ran cold. The shuttle's engines roared back to life without warning. And before they could react, they were pushed away, sent tumbling back toward the Valiant by an unseen force. The last thing Ward saw before they were thrown into space was a single glowing symbol appearing on the Erebus hull. A human symbol. A Terran insignia. And then, in an instant, the Erebus vanished. Gone, as if it had never existed. The power of a ghost. Admiral Kane sat motionless, staring at the screen. Project Erebus. Missing 247 years ago. The words burned into his mind. This wasn't just an experimental warship or some hidden black project that had suddenly resurfaced. It was something much worse. It was a ghost. A warship from the past that should have been long destroyed. And yet it had appeared at the exact moment humanity needed it most. Kane exhaled, trying to think clearly. If this ship had vanished nearly 2.5 centuries ago, then there was only one question left. How had it come back? A lead from the shadows. The bridge of the HSS Valiant was quiet. The battle was over, but no one celebrated. They all felt it. Something wasn't right. Commander Rain Carter approached Kane cautiously. "Sir, I did a deeper search into Project Erebus." Kane turned to her sharply. "And?" She hesitated. "Everything about it is locked under ultra-black clearance. Even the highest levels of command can't access it." Kane frowned. "There has to be something. A location. A name." Carter took a deep breath. "One thing. A single classified distress signal from 247 years ago." Kane's stomach twisted. "Where?" She pulled up a star map and pointed to a sector on the outer edge of known space. Omega 7. A dead system. No colonies, no recorded activity. Just an empty part of the galaxy that no ship had visited in over 2 centuries. Kane narrowed his eyes. That couldn't be a coincidence. The journey to Omega 7. Hours later, the Valiant left the battlefield and set course for Omega 7. The crew was nervous. No one said it out loud, but they all knew the truth. They were chasing a ghost. As they neared the system, long-range sensors picked up something unexpected. A shipwreck, a massive derelict warship drifting near a dead planet. It was ancient, covered in deep battle scars, its hull torn open in places. It looked exactly like the Erebus, but it was dead. No power signatures, no life readings. Kane felt his skin crawl. Was this the original Erebus? The impossible wreck? The Valiant moved into close range. Kane ordered a recon team to board the wreck and search for answers. Commander Carter and a squad of Marines suited up, taking the shuttle toward the dead warship. As they entered, a cold chill filled the air. The ship's interior was silent, frozen in time. Dust covered the control panels. The lights were dark. The walls were marked with old energy burns, signs of a brutal battle. And then they found the first body, a human skeleton, still wearing an ancient Terran military uniform. Carter swallowed hard. "Sir, this ship was crewed." Kane's voice came through the comms. "Search the command center. We need to know what happened here." The captain's log. Carter's team reached the bridge of the derelict warship. The captain's chair sat empty, its screens dark. But there was one active device, a small, blinking console. A message had been left behind. A final log entry. Carter activated it, and a voice filled the air. It was old, distorted by centuries of decay. "This is Captain Elias Ward of the TSS Erebus." Carter's heart pounded. The original Erebus. The message continued. "We are the last survivors of the Dark Horizon experiment. Our ship was designed to test new gravitational drive technology, but something went wrong. A long pause. Static crackled. We were thrown into a place outside of time. A void. A prison. The voice grew weaker. I don't know how long we've been gone. Days? Years? Centuries? A heavy breath. The ship, it changed. It became something else. The voice faltered. We're not alone here. The recording cut out. A cold silence filled the room. Carter turned to her team. We need to leave. Now. The return of the ghost. Before they could move, the derelict ship powered on. Screens lit up. Lights flickered. The air hummed with energy. A deep voice echoed through the corridors. You should not have come. The ship began to shift, as if awakening from a long sleep. The Marines ran for the shuttle, panic setting in. Carter gasped as she glanced out a viewport. Something moved in the darkness. Something that was watching them. And then, the Erebus returned. Not the wreck. The real Erebus. It materialized out of nowhere, appearing alongside the Valiant in an instant. For a brief moment, the two ships, the past and the present, existed together. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the derelict ship disintegrated into nothing. Gone. The Erebus had erased its own past. Carter and her team barely made it back to the Valiant, breathless, shaken, and confused. Kane stood at the viewport, watching the Erebus in the distance. It had returned. But now he understood. This wasn't just a warship. It was something more. Something beyond time. Beyond death. And it had chosen to protect humanity. The panic of the enemy. The Erebus floated silently in space, its black hull reflecting no light, no energy. It had appeared at the exact moment the derelict version of itself had crumbled into nothing. Admiral Kane had no words. Something beyond reason had just happened. The Erebus wasn't just a ship. It was something more, something that existed outside of normal time and space. And the worst part, it knew what they had done. The moment Carter's team had accessed the old logs, the Erebus had returned. Not to attack, not to explain, just to watch. Kane turned to Carter, who was still catching her breath after barely making it back from the derelict ship. Did you hear the log? Did you hear what the old captain said? Carter nodded, her face pale. They were trapped, outside time, she whispered. Kane's fists clenched. And now, the Erebus is back. Sir, the comms officer spoke hesitantly. We're receiving another message. Kane inhaled sharply. From the Erebus? She shook her head. No, sir. She looked up. It's from the Zarkians. A fear they can't explain. The Zarkian High Command had not spoken to humanity in decades. They had never negotiated, never surrendered, never acknowledged humans as equals. But now, they were sending a direct, urgent message. Kane exhaled and signaled for it to be put through. The view screen flickered to life, revealing High Lord Vrexa, the warlord of the Zarkians. His eyes, once cold and ruthless, were wide with fear. Human, he spoke, his voice strained. Do you understand what you have done? Kane crossed his arms. What exactly are you talking about? Vrexa's mandibles clicked, his gaze shifting past Kane, toward the Erebus. That thing. It does not belong here. You should not have woken it. Kane narrowed his eyes. You're afraid of it. Vrexa bared his teeth. We are not afraid of humans. We never were. But this. He pointed a claw at the view screen. This is not human. Not anymore. Kane felt a chill run down his spine. You've seen it before. The Zarkian warlord hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. Long ago, before your species ever left your homeworld, our ancestors made a mistake. We ventured into the unknown. We found something, waiting. Something that should have been left alone. He exhaled sharply. And we paid the price. Kane's breath caught. The Erebus had been missing for 247 years, but the Zarkians had encountered it before that. How? And more importantly, what had they seen? The war ends before it begins. Vrex's voice lowered. Listen to me, human. Whatever you think that Warship is, it is not your ally. It does not fight for you. It does not fight for anyone. Kane held his ground. Then why did it destroy your fleet? Why did it save us? Vrex's mandibles twitched. Because it follows a pattern. Kane frowned. A pattern. Vrex's claws curled. It appears only when the balance is broken. When destruction is inevitable. It wipes out the stronger force. It does not matter who that force is. He leaned forward, his alien eyes filled with warning. One day, Admiral, your people will become the stronger force. The room went silent. And when that happens, the Erebus will return. Not as your savior. As your executioner. A long pause. Then, Vrexa did something no human had ever seen before. He lowered his head. Not in submission. In respect. And fear. The Zarkians surrendered. The war was over. Not because humanity had won, but because their greatest enemy was too afraid to continue. The power of a ghost. The Erebus remained silent. It did not respond to messages. It did not move. It simply watched. Days passed. The galaxy changed overnight. The Zarkians, once conquerors, withdrew to their own territory. The war ended without a final battle. All because of one ship. But the question remained, who or what was controlling it? And if the Erebus was protecting humanity now, how long would that last? Admiral Kane stood alone in his quarters, watching the warship from the viewport. It was still there, hovering in space, unmoving. A guardian, a ghost, a warning. And then, just like before, it vanished. No flash, no sound. Gone. And in that moment, Kane understood. The Erebus wasn't just a warship. It was something much, much older. And when humanity's power became too great, it would return. This time, not as a savior, but as the force that kept the balance. Humanity's secret weapon. The Erebus was gone. Just as suddenly as it had arrived, it had vanished without a trace. No energy signature, no warp trail, no explanation. It was as if it had never existed. But its presence had changed everything. The Zarkian Empire had surrendered without a fight. Their fleets had retreated into deep space, their warlords refusing to speak another word about the ghost ship that had turned their strongest dreadnoughts into dust. Humanity had won the war, but they had no idea how. A dangerous obsession. Admiral Kane sat alone in his quarters aboard the HSS Valiant, staring at a blank screen. He had reviewed the battle logs over 100 times. There was no logic to it. The Erebus was real. And yet, the official records did not acknowledge its existence. Every time he tried to report the warship to high command, his messages were mysteriously deleted. His access to archived records was revoked. Any attempt to investigate Project Erebus was met with a full system lockdown. Someone somewhere wanted the truth buried. The one rule. The agent picked up the data pad and erased the file with a single press of his fingers. This conversation never happened, he said. You will never mention the Erebus again. If you do. He let the silence hang in the air. Kane scowled. You expect me to pretend none of this is real? The agent stepped toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced over his shoulder. The Erebus was never ours to control. Then, without another word, he was gone. The door slid shut, and Admiral Kane was left with the truth. The warning that couldn't be ignored. The war was over. Humanity had won without ever firing the final shot. But Kane knew the truth. The Erebus wasn't a victory. It was a warning. A warship that should have never returned. A machine that had stared into the abyss and come back. Changed. The Zarkians had feared it. Black Ops wanted it erased. And yet, Kane couldn't stop thinking about it. He looked out the viewport, where the Erebus had once been. It was gone now. But somehow he knew it would return. And next time, it might not be on humanity's side. The message left behind. The Erebus was gone. The war was over. The Zarkians had surrendered. Humanity had won. And yet, Admiral Kane felt no victory. The weight of what he had learned sat heavy on his chest. The Erebus wasn't just a ship. It was a mistake that had returned from somewhere unknown. Somewhere that even the most powerful forces in the galaxy feared. And now it had vanished again. But Kane wasn't fooled. It would be back. A silent warning. For the next few days, the HSS Valiant remained stationed near the abandoned Omega-7 system. Officially, they were overseeing the withdrawal of the last Zarkian forces, but Kane had another reason. He was waiting for any sign of the Erebus. Then, it happened. At 3:47 hours, the ship's long-range sensors picked up an anomaly. It wasn't an energy spike. It wasn't a warp signature. It wasn't anything normal. It was just an absence, a region of space where nothing existed. And at the center of that void, a single transmission. Kane's blood ran cold. "Patch it through," he ordered. The bridge crew hesitated. After everything that had happened, no one wanted to hear what the Erebus had to say. But they obeyed. The speakers crackled. Then a voice, deep, distorted, neither fully mechanical nor fully human. A voice that did not belong to the living. "You are not ready." The message ended. Silence. Kane clenched his fists. "What the hell does that mean?" one of his officers whispered. Kane exhaled. He didn't know. But one thing was clear. The Erebus was watching them. And it had left them a warning. A hidden transmission. Kane ordered his communications officer to run an analysis on the transmission. If the Erebus had left them a message, there had to be more to it. Sure enough, there was. Beneath the spoken words, hidden in the signal structure, there was something else. A second transmission. But it wasn't a message. It was a set of coordinates. The bridge fell silent. The coordinates led to a place outside of human territory, far beyond the known hyperlanes. A dead zone. A region of space where no ships ever returned. Kane's jaw tightened. The Erebus had left them a choice. Ignore the message, and humanity could continue believing they had won the war. Or follow the coordinates and uncover whatever truth had been buried for over 2 centuries. Kane turned to his officers. "Prepare the ship," he said. The bridge crew stared at him. "Sir, you can't be serious," Carter said. "We barely survived our last encounter with that thing. What if this is a trap?" Kane shook his head. "The Erebus saved us once. If it wanted us dead, we'd be dead already." Carter frowned. "So what do you think it wants?" Kane looked back at the screen, where the coordinates blinked like a beacon in the dark. "I don't know." His voice was quiet. "But I intend to find out." Into the unknown. 12 hours later, the Valiant entered deep space, pushing toward the location the Erebus had given them. It was uncharted territory. No planets, no stars, just a vast, empty void. Until they found it. The station. It was massive, an ancient construct orbiting a dead world. The hull was dark, its surface covered in strange, unreadable symbols. It was not human, and it was not abandoned. "Sir," the sensor officer whispered, "we're detecting something inside." Kane's heart pounded. The Erebus had led them here. But why? And more importantly, what was waiting for them inside? The legend begins. The HSS Valiant drifted in the cold darkness of deep space, its hull illuminated only by distant starlight. Before them, an ancient station loomed. Silent, unmarked, forgotten. It wasn't human. And yet, the Erebus had led them here. Admiral Kane stood on the bridge, staring at the alien structure through the main viewport. His gut told him that whatever lay inside would change everything. His officers sat in tense silence, waiting for an order. Kane inhaled slowly. Send a recon team. The station that shouldn't exist. Minutes later, Commander Rain Carter and a squad of Marines landed on the station's outer shell. The structure was vast, its surface covered in faded markings that pulsed faintly with an eerie glow. "This thing is ancient," Carter murmured, running a gloved hand over the metal. "It's been here for centuries." The team reached a large circular door, untouched by time. Then, it opened, without a sound, without a command. It was waiting for them. Carter's breath hitched. "Command, we're going in." Inside the forgotten vault. The interior was massive, a cavernous space filled with structures that resembled data cores, control panels, and containment chambers. But everything was dead. No power, no signs of life. Then, one of the Marines stopped. "Sir, over here." Carter turned. At the center of the chamber stood a single pedestal, and resting on it, a Terran insignia, a human mark. Carter's pulse pounded. "This place, it's connected to us." She stepped forward, brushing dust off the pedestal. A holographic interface activated, flickering to life with a single stored message. A human transmission. It was over 250 years old. The same era when the Erebus vanished. Carter's heart pounded. "Command, you need to hear this." The captain's final lock. The hologram flickered, and a man in an old Terran officer's uniform appeared. Captain Elias Ward. The same name from the Erebus' last recorded log. His voice was weak, strained. "If you're hearing this, then the Erebus has returned." A pause. "I was the last captain of the Erebus. Our ship was lost. Taken. Somewhere outside of time. We weren't the first to arrive there. And we weren't the last." The screen flickered, his voice breaking. "We saw things we weren't meant to see. A war that never ended. A force older than the stars themselves." He exhaled sharply. "We were not supposed to leave." Another pause. Then, his gaze turned sharp, his voice desperate. "You have to stop it. The Erebus isn't just a warship anymore. It's something else." Static crackled. "It was changed. We were changed. And one day, it will make its choice." His next words sent an icy chill through the team. "If it ever returns to you, note this." A sudden burst of static drowned out the rest. Then, one final whisper. "Pray you never see it again." The message ended. Silence filled the chamber. Carter stared at the projection, stomach twisting. The Erebus hadn't saved them. It had returned for a reason. And whatever it had become, it wasn't finished. The war that never ended. Back on the Valiant, Admiral Kane gripped the console, his mind racing. The Erebus wasn't just a lost ship. It had been trapped in something outside of time, something beyond human understanding. And now it was back. Had it truly saved them? Or was it waiting for something more? As Kane stared at the ancient station, a thought crept into his mind. The Zarkians had surrendered. Not because they feared humanity. Because they feared what came next. The ghost vanishes again. Hours later, the Valiant left the station, sealing it behind them. They had uncovered as much as they could. But no one felt victorious. They had only scratched the surface of something far greater. And then, as if sensing its role was done, the Erebus returned one final time. It appeared beside the fleet, silent, watching. Kane stood at the viewport, locking eyes with the warship that shouldn't exist. A whisper echoed through the ship's comms. "Balance must be maintained." Then, without a sound, the Erebus vanished. This time, for good. Or so they hoped. A legend is born. The war was never spoken of again. The official records said the Zarkians surrendered on their own. The Erebus was erased from history. But deep in the ranks of the Terran Navy, the whispers remained. A ship that shouldn't exist. A war that was never meant to be won. A presence that watched from the shadows, waiting. And so the legend of the Erebus was born. The warship that defied time. the ghost that decided the fate of empires. And one day, it would return again.